I'm Amy Meek, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Welcome to Spread the Word, a podcast brought to you by Biz. Our mission is to interview and share perspectives on gender to our community. You're here with Audrey, Cindy, Ahana, Isha, Liz, Serena, and Aaron.
Hello, this is our first episode of the new year and new semester. Today, Liz and I got to talk with Attorney Amy Meek about her work in the legal field concerning women's rights, gender equity, and more. Special thank you to Attorney Amy Meek, and we hope you enjoy. So our first question is, could you please describe some of your legal work in advocacy and gender equity and women's rights?
Sure. So I worked in the Women's and Reproductive Rights Project at the ACLU of Illinois for 5 years. And in that capacity, I worked on a number of issues that relate to gender discrimination and women's rights. So that includes not just reproductive rights, but also issues like pregnancy discrimination. Several of the cases and clients that I worked with were related to issues of workplace discrimination, either based on someone's pregnancy and in some cases just purely based on gender. So for example, I worked on a case against the Chicago Fire Department, which not only had policies that were discriminatory against pregnant employees, they also had facilities issues that discriminated against anyone who used basically all women's, anyone who wanted to use a female restroom, because their firehouses often did not include shower facilities, locker rooms, or restrooms designated for women.
Wait, so there was so in the Chicago firehouse departments, a lot of the time wasn't, like you said, showers, bathrooms for women?
Yeah, it's shocking that, in the 21st century that we would be dealing with issues that basic around, workplace gender discrimination. But the Chicago Fire Department has over 100 fire stations, firehouses, that have, some of them are over 100 years old. So they have a lot of facilities problems. There are firehouses that are small, where it's hard to renovate them, where there are kind of some other basic structural issues and repairs that they're struggling with. But many of them, even built through as recently as I want to say the 1960s, didn't anticipate that there would be female firefighters. And so were built in this kind of classic or I don't know if I should call it classic, but this sort of communal setting that assumed that it would be, a group of 10 or 15 male firefighters all living together. So, one big sleeping area, one big, shower room, one restroom with urinals and toilet stalls, and one locker room. And then, when they started hiring women as firefighters in the 80s, they had to figure out how they were going to retrofit these facilities. And in a lot of cases, which legitimately, is expensive and challenging to do. But the truth still is that they started hiring women as firefighters in the 80s, and still to this day, many of the firehouses still are in this setup, have not really properly been retrofitted, and they haven't sort of taken measures to to always ensure that women have appropriate facilities issues. So for example, one client who I represented, she was a firefighter, and of course, because there's also been a history of discrimination against women in hiring at the Chicago Fire Department. For years, they used hiring tests that, for example, used a lot of strength tests and other things that tended to discriminate against women, but not in a way that actually made them better firefighters often. Many of the women who work at the Chicago Fire Department are more junior. They've been hired more recently. They come into these workplaces that, often are kind of overtly hostile to them. And even sort of the pure layout of the firehouse is designed to sort of say, you are an afterthought. We did not think you were going to be here. You're not part of sort of who the Chicago Fire Department thinks of as as a typical employee. So this firefighter who I'd been representing had been on the job for, I think, over a year. And because the firehouse that she had been assigned to, was just this sort of communal setup where if she wanted to shower, she would either have to, literally go in and shower with the men, or she would have to, what they told her in kind of an attempt to be welcoming when she first started was, just let us know if you need to shower, let us know. We'll lock the door and tell everybody that they have to get out. So, it's like well-intentioned maybe, but literally, saying to her, like, if you need to shower, everyone else has to leave. You're going to have to inconvenience everybody else. And, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that typically the time when firefighters shower is either kind of at the beginning or end of their shift. So that's a time when the shifts are changing, where there's a lot of people who need to shower, or right after a fire is when you're like, that's from a health and safety rationale. That's when you're supposed to shower so that you don't have chemicals and things sort of seeping into your skin. And so everybody who's worked on that fire needs to shower. And so saying to her, like, you're going to need to shut everybody else out is really, sends a really pretty clear message, like, you're inconveniencing everybody else. And so as a result, she literally had never showered at that firehouse. She told me, I was lucky because every time, there's not that many fires, fortunately, so I was lucky that every time had to respond to a fire, it was near the end of the shift. And so I carried some like wipes with me so that I could kind of clean up a little bit. And then I would go home and shower there because it was, just such a clear sort of unequal access to facilities.
Wow, I can't even believe that, honestly, that like these facilities, no matter how old, I feel, and I understand that like, it's hard to like renovate things, but like we are in a different age now where like anybody can be anything. And so I don't, the fact that they don't account for that is actually still mind blowing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty shocking. And I think since then they have been taking more steps to actually try to really remedy their facilities plan, but it is slow going. I think, something else I think is kind of interesting about those issues around fire station access and facilities is that now with newer fire stations that are being built, newer firehouses, the model is much more towards creating kind of individual spaces so that people aren't all sleeping in one big open bunk room, and people have a little bit more privacy and, kind of individual changing areas, individual bathrooms, individual sleeping areas. And that not only avoids some of these issues around trying to figure out, well, okay, how big does the communal bathroom need to be for the men versus for the women? Because how many men do we think we're going to have versus women? But it also actually creates a much better sleeping and working environment because they're there for these long shifts. It creates a better environment for everybody because most people don't want to be sleeping in one big open area with everybody that they work with. People are snoring, people are getting up. Most people actually do value some level of individual privacy in their living areas. And so this movement towards making firehouses less discriminatory actually improves conditions for everybody.
So then our next question we have for you is, are there any things that you faced or experienced uniquely as a woman in the legal field and in law school, or do you feel that you had more similar experiences / opportunities as your male counterparts?
I definitely, I don't think it's the same. One of the clearest sort of experiences that I've had that I can point to that's not necessarily about being a woman, but is about being someone who's been pregnant, had a baby, and lactated and nursed, was specifically in the legal profession. I took the bar exam in Illinois. I had twins, took the bar exam when my twins were about 6 months old. and emailed. So still breastfeeding, but not, we were supplementing, but I was still pumping pretty regularly. And I knew that there should be accommodations available for pumping during the bar exam. And just to give a little bit of background about the bar exam, I mean, it's typically a day-long exam. So if you're there for the whole day, you are going to need to pump. Usually if you're breastfeeding, you need to express breast milk. You need to either nurse or pump, about every three to 4 hours typically. Some people it's less, some people might be able to go a little bit longer, but if you don't do that, then it becomes really uncomfortable. And in addition to being uncomfortable and painful, you can actually have health complications. So you can get mastitis or other things, which is basically a blockage of your milk ducts if you don't, if you wait too long. So it is a condition that you need accommodations for. In Illinois, I emailed the Board of Bar Examiners and said, what are the accommodations for pumping? And they said, well, the accommodation is that you can bring your pump in. So no special breaks. You can bring your pump in, and you can use the pump in one of the restrooms to pump. Which also, if anything about breastfeeding, is really if you wouldn't, I mean, the typical analogy is, breast milk is food. If you wouldn't make a sandwich in the restroom, don't expect people to pump in a restroom. And this is actually something that I really regret. At the time, I had 6-month-old twins. I was thinking about the bar exam. I was like, fine, if I need to pump in the restroom during my lunch break, that, I'll just, it's just one time, I'll just do it. The last thing that I want to do is get into a fight with the Board of Bar Examiners about this. So even though I thought it was kind of ridiculous, I think sometimes also as women lawyers, it's oh, well, that's just the profession. Nobody's going to help you. You got to just tough it through. So I put up with it. And then literally the next year I was working at the ACLU, and we learned of a woman who was due to give birth actually right before the bar exam, and she was her baby was gonna be a month old. She had asked for accommodations, and they gave her the exact same spiel. And to her credit, she was like, no, this is ridiculous. And also because she was gonna have a newborn, she was gonna need more breaks. It was gonna be more important to her to pump in a clean environment because she was gonna have a newborn baby who was going to be really primarily relying on her breast milk to survive. So she had written a letter to them. She had gotten the same response. And the board, and this is the other thing, the Board of Arguments was this is the first time, no one's ever complained about these accommodations before. And in my head, I was like, now, I mean, I feel like that was also a lesson to me of, I think sometimes I've certainly internalized this sometimes of, oh, well, just tough it out. Don't make waves. It's not a big deal. Just do it. But that was such a lesson to me of that. Not only had I really not stood up for my own rights, but that actually does have ripple effects for other people. So I was really thrilled that we were able to actually get involved and help write a letter to the Board of Bar Examiners to help ensure that not only did she get those accommodations, but that they actually changed their policies and procedures to be more accommodating of anybody who was a nursing parent on the bar exam and needed those accommodations. And I think that testing cycle, it ended up being something like 5 or 6 other nursing parents who were able to make use of that. So I think that is one example of where, that's not necessarily about being a woman, but it is about being someone who's lactating, breastfeeding, someone who's been pregnant, and that often these systems are, not set up to accommodate nursing parents. And then, when you seek those accommodations, you get more pushback than you might think.
Yeah, that's so crazy to me that when you asked for accommodations, they said your accommodation is just to bring in the pump and to use the restroom. It's ridiculous, but also I think I'm not completely surprised by that fact in a way, because I feel like that is kind of how our society has run for a really long time.
Can I also ask, how many breaks do you get during the bar exam?
It's not that many. Like, my recollection is that you have maybe a little bit of time coming in the morning, and then I think you just have a lunch break, and then basically, like, the end of the day. There might be a quick bathroom break in
But
the
that's still not enough
but it's
time to like fully,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, to fully set up
yeah.
and everything else. So that was a big, a big part of it too. And what it meant ultimately for the people who got pumping accommodations was that they had to have a separate proctor because they needed more time for
Yeah.
pumping. But I mean, those are all, within sort of the realm of accommodations that you can make for other medical conditions. It's just that it takes more work, and it requires, treating this as a legitimate need.
Mhm. I have another question about that. Do you think that the lack of accommodations might have turned away some working mothers or parents who wanted to take the bar exam, but they might not have been able to because of those restrictions or limitations to what they had to do during the bar exam?
I don't know whether it's that direct of a barrier. I do think, I've certainly heard of situations with pregnancy accommodations and breastfeeding accommodations where, it creates real hurdles in terms of people's ability to continue working at their job, people being placed on leave, workers being denied light duty accommodations. And in this case, I think I mean, who knows whether it made, that big of a difference, but I think denying people accommodations for pregnancy or for breastfeeding in some ways is not that different from what I was talking about with unequal facilities for women, which, again, I mean, there are ways to get around it, but it sends the signal, that this system is not created for you, and you're an aberration within that system. And I think, sometimes those signals can really add up and present a much bigger barrier.
Thank you. Our next question is, what has been the biggest challenge through your work in the legal area with civil rights and through your work in the legal field?
Wow. I'm not sure I know what the biggest challenge is. I can talk about some challenges. I mean, I think there are a couple of big challenges when it comes to gender discrimination and issues relating to women and women's bodies is definitely stigma. That it's there's a ton of stigma around reproductive rights. There's a ton of stigma also even around pregnancy and breastfeeding. People find it difficult to talk about abortions, to say the word abortion, to talk about breastfeeding and say the word breast. At one point, I remember in negotiating around a breastfeeding policy, the folks on the other side asked, is there any way that we can change the title of this policy so that it doesn't include the word breast in it? Because we're worried that it's going to give people the giggles. And so, like, when you're dealing with sort of like that basic level of stigma and shame around just women having bodies, and women having control of their own bodies, I think that's a huge hurdle to overcome before you even sort of start talking about, what rights they have with their bodies. I think, there's also another issue around a lot of this, pregnancy discrimination, reproductive rights, is around sort of stereotypes and images of women as mothers, and who's a good mother. This sort of like idea that women should want to have babies, that they should be home with their babies, and that's sort of what makes them whole. And it is a lot of stereotypes and ideas about what makes somebody a good mother, or a bad mother, and shaming around that. Those are huge obstacles to get over. Another issue that I haven't really talked a lot about is, the intersections of race and gender. And again, a lot of people are really uncomfortable talking about race. A lot of people don't always think about the ways in which race and gender intersect in these areas. And it's definitely also true that in and around, pregnancy discrimination, reproductive rights, the women who are often the most policed and the most harmed by by discrimination and lack of protections are Black women and other women of color.
So then, sorry, our next question is, are there any misconceptions people seem to have about women's rights and gender equality in the legal field?
Well, there are a lot of misconceptions. A couple that I can think of. So one is, particularly because I did a lot of work on pregnancy discrimination, I think that's an area I can talk about. A lot of people do not realize that, don't realize that pregnancy discrimination is illegal. I think people are sort of, well, often kind of at the level of realizing that in most situations you at least can't talk about discriminating against someone because they're a woman, or discriminating against somebody based on their race. But a lot of people, I think, don't even realize that pregnancy discrimination is illegal, and still sort of have this idea of like, well, someone who's pregnant they should go home if they can't work. Same thing, with somebody who's nursing a baby.
I just had a general question. So when a woman goes on maternity leave, do you know how much the time is that they get off, or do they get paid for that time? Because I've always just had that question in my mind.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is really, it depends a lot on what state you live in, and also sort of who your employer is, and what their other policies are. So nationally, our policies around leave for new parents are just terrible. So in general, nationally, people are generally only entitled to FMLA, so the Family and Medical Leave Act, which entitles you to up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Um, and that's even that does not apply to every employee in this country. I'm blanking on what the exact requirements are, but you typically have to have been working at the employer for, I think, for over a year, I want to say, and you typically have to be pretty much full time. So even that, like, really terrible benefit. I mean, it's almost not a benefit to be able to at least take unpaid leave, and not lose your job during that time. But even that is not universal. Sometimes pregnancy is covered as a short-term disability, so like time to recover from childbirth. So if your employer has like other types of short-term disability policies, then typically pregnancy is covered under that. But yeah, there are actually really only a few states that guarantee anything sort of like paid leave for new parents. In Illinois, the probably the biggest addition to your rights is that we have a really good pregnancy discrimination act that's in our state laws. And so that basically means that if your employer offers other types of employees paid leave, then they have to offer you kind of similar paid leave for recovering from childbirth. But even that sort of depends on your employer, giving that to other employees. Or the other way in which the Illinois law works is that it requires reasonable accommodations. So if the employer can give you leave without it being an undue hardship, then they have to do that. But again, that doesn't necessarily entitle you to very much in the way of leave.
Wow. Yeah, I've always been so sorry. I've just always been so curious about that.
I'm also wondering if there's any guidelines on childcare, like after the woman has had her baby. Is there any sort of federal guideline or like state policies that help mothers with that in the workplace as well?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have nationally subsidized childcare. And, I think even, within a state like Illinois, there's some amount of subsidized childcare out there based on income. And then in terms of, being able to take time off, for example, to like take your child to a doctor's appointment or something like that, that again is covered under FMLA. So if, for example, if you've used up your 12 weeks, by, being on leave to recover from childbirth, then that's not going to be available for you down the line if your baby's sick and you just take them to a doctor's appointment or something like that. Again, in Illinois, we do have this law that requires reasonable accommodations. It doesn't, yeah, I would say that it doesn't really extend as far as sort of like once you're actually caring for your baby, it more relates to pregnancy and childbirth. But I do think it is part of this, that we in the United States have just, so few protections or policies that encourage or protect workers with any kind of caregiving responsibilities.
Okay. I see. So our next question is, do you have any advice for female students or young women who are interested in pursuing a career in law/civil rights?
So, well, I think one piece of advice that I have that I wish that I had taken more is to stand up for yourself, and to stand up for others when you yourself are experiencing discrimination, or when you see other people, experiencing discrimination, or whose rights are being affected, particularly for women. I think we're often socialized not to stand up for ourselves. And so in some ways it can be easier, I think, to sort of almost think about it as, standing up for myself actually means that it's going to protect other people down the line. But I do think that that's important. I think that the legal profession is changing to some extent, becoming, I think, more friendly to women, but it's still, I think, particularly, as with many professions, there are a lot more women and folks of color at the more junior levels. And then, as you sort of go up into kind of, either people who are tenured law professors, people who are partners in law firms, it becomes much whiter and more male. And so I think the other piece of advice that I would give, particularly young women, is to, find other women who are like-minded, who care about the same things that you do. Be a team together so that you can support each other's ideas. You can help kind of uplift what other people are saying in meetings or in class, and you can continue to be that network throughout your careers, because some of that, there is kind of a, old boys network in a lot of professional environments. And one way I think that that women starting out can start to push back against that is by working together, uplifting what other women are saying in meetings so that they're not getting talked over or their ideas aren't being kind of co-opted by other people, talking to each other about, negotiating for salary, what people are getting paid, what professional opportunities are out there, and you kind of creating your own network, because you're in some ways pushing back against a kind of established network and power structure that is already there and is not always the friendliest to young women.
Well, I think, that was like all the questions we had for you today. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
That's the end of our first episode of 2021, and we hope you really enjoyed it. If you want to be on the podcast, there is a Google form on our Instagram, which is @Bayes_IMSA. If you want to watch a caption video of the episode, you can also go to our YouTube channel, which is Bayes_IMSA in all caps. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to spread the word.